I am delighted to invite you to thank you all for joining us today and to thank the Census Bureau in particular for accepting an invitation from the Partnership for America's Children, the Coalition on Human Needs, NALEO, and the National Urban League to talk with us about the blended base, the research that they are conducting on the impact of the blended base and its implications for funding. We're really fortunate today to have with us Eric Jensen and Luke Rogers, who will be presenting, and also Christine Hartley. I think we all know how important the role of census data is in allocating federal funds to children's programs and to programs that serve Black communities and Hispanic communities and many other communities around our country. And we also know that the pandemic created a huge crisis for the Bureau, which it addressed as well as could be done, but it was still a pretty big problem. So the blended base is a critical approach to figuring out how to mitigate some of the challenges that the pandemic created for us all. With that, I'm going to turn this over, but I do want to say before we do that, a couple of things. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I will be monitoring it, or you can put your hands up. We do want to make this more like a conversation and make sure that all your questions get answered. We did also share with the census folk a set of questions that we knew a number of people had in advance to try and make sure that they were prepared to cover the questions that we could anticipate. But this really is meant to be a conversation about this very important development of the blended base and its effort to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on funding for the programs we care about so much. With that, Eric and Luke, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Deb. I'll go ahead and pull up the presentation. Okay, please let me know if you can see the presentation in presentation mode.
Yes, we can see it.
Looks good.
Great. All right. So good afternoon. My name is Eric Jensen. I'm the Senior Technical Expert for Demographic Analysis in the Population Division. Demographic analysis is one of our 2 coverage measures at the Census Bureau. Today we're going to be talking about the Census Bureau's blended base. We'll also talk the blended base for population estimates. We'll also talk a little bit about what we're calling our base evaluation research team. And you may have heard some information about that at previous meetings. And then I'll also talk about the Young Children Working Group. I know that a lot of people on the call have an interest in data on young children, on the coverage for young children, and that's something that we'll address as well. So to start off, we're going to have Luke Rogers. He's going to talk about the blended base. So Luke, just let me know when to advance the slide.
Okay, slide 3, please. It didn't update. Oh, there it goes. All right. Thank you, Eric. So my name is Luke Rogers. I'm the chief of the Population Estimates branch here in the Population Division. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our Population Estimates program, what we do. It sounds like you're well aware, but the Population Estimates program disseminates the official measures of the population and housing units between decennial censuses. And the reason we do this, it's mandated by federal law. It's used for a variety of things. Federal Election Commission uses these data, as well as a bunch of different funding allocations are made based off of the data we produce. A lot of different surveys use our data as controls, like the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey. And our data are delivered to a variety of different stakeholders that would use them for things like denominators for rates. So if you see like a death rate or something along those lines, our numbers are critical in making sure that they have the appropriate population as a denominator. Aside from that, a lot of academic research or business research uses our data for a variety of different purposes. And we also, a lot of our data is used for public planning by different state, local communities, as well as the federal government. So these data are released every year. and it's a time series starting with the last census and working our way forward. So the vintage, when we call them vintages, is the whole time series from the last census to the current year that we're in. So right now we've created vintage 2021, and this winter we'll create vintage 2022. So right now vintage 2021 goes from April 2020 to July 1st, 2021. And then once we release vintage 2022, we'll go back and we'll redo the whole time series starting with April 2020 out to July 2022. So that's that. Next slide, please. So when we create the estimates, the starting point is what we call the estimates base. And typically the estimates base is just fully sourced from the decennial census. And the decennial census provides us with a lot of different characteristics that we require for production of the estimates. So we create a lot of detail. We create county level age, sex, single year of age, sex, race, 31 race groups, and Hispanic origin for every single county in the country. And to do that, we need corresponding detail from the census.
We seem to have lost your audio.
I think we lost Luke. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I
Yeah.
said I
I'm
was.
going to fix it. I was trying to solve the background problem and I made a mistake. Let me just unmute him.
Oh,
I
okay.
thought it was someone else. I apologize.
No worries. Can you hear me now?
Luke, is that you? Yes.
Yes, you can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead. I apologize very much. I thought I was muting someone else.
How far did I get before I was muted?
We lost you just probably
I'll just continue to slide over.
Only a moment ago.
Okay,
Sorry.
so because of the pandemic, there were a number of schedule constraints that required us to go back and try to think about how we could produce the estimates, and in particular how we could start with a estimates base that had the detail we required. So some of these schedule constraints were we just weren't sure when we'd be receiving the internal 2020 census files. We also wanted time to look into the 2020 census data and really determine what parts of it we would want to use for the estimates, what was suitable. And some of this, for example, the race detail in the census has some other race, and we would need to go back and do our modified race procedures to distribute the some other race category across the other race groups. So we would need time to do this. And finally, for data that we do pull directly from the census edited file, which is the non-noisy file, we would have to consider differential privacy and the different requirements. And some of that was still in development when we were doing the estimates. And we've been working with the Center for Enterprise Dissemination and Disclosure Avoidance to work through vintage 2021, particularly our sub-county estimates that do have differential privacy applied. And then finally, the differentially private 2020 census files that we do or will get access to don't necessarily have the variables we need to do estimates production, like MAF-ID, or as I was mentioning before, that modified race variable that would have the race categories and the appropriate categories for estimates production. Next slide. So what did we do for the blended base? Since we didn't have this full detail 2020 census data that we would normally have, we had to figure out a way to essentially do our best to estimate it. So what we ended up doing was we used 3 different data sources. We used April 1st estimates from vintage 2020. So these are 2010 based estimates that provide full detail county population estimates by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And that's down to the county. We also used another product produced by our area, and Eric led this effort, the 2020 demographic analysis estimates. And we use this by sex and age up to 85 and older by single year of age. And then finally, we used the 2020 Census PL public law data for the resident population totals. So the benefits of doing it this way was that we weren't touching the unprotected 2020 census data, so we didn't have to worry about differential privacy. Since we were using demographic analysis, which is one of the official measures of coverage for the census, we could actually kind of look at those coverage issues and incorporate a way to mitigate some of them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And another benefit is because we did it this way, our total county population, the total resident populations for the counties would match what was previously released in the census, the 2020 census counts. Now, some limitations that we knew of when we went into this project were that any inaccuracies that were in vintage 2020, whether it was like a GQ that we missed or maybe a component of change didn't measure exactly the way we wanted it to, those things would be carried into the blended base. So we knew this was going to happen, and because we used vintage 2020 so heavily, there wasn't really a way around it for vintage 2021. Next slide. So here is a graphic that kind of illustrates how the blended base was made. So you can see on the left the three data sources: the 2020 census, the 2020 DA estimates, and the vintage 2021 or vintage 2020 estimates. And you can see if you start from left and you work your way right, all three of those data sources go into creating a blended national version. So from there, you can see the DA bar or the DA arrow doesn't extend to any of the other subnational geographies, and that's because it doesn't we don't deed, it's only national level, so it only really is directly being used to create national blended estimates. But the 2020 census totals and the vintage 2020 characteristics are used to create a state level estimates for full detail and county level estimates for full detail, and they use that national data as a control. And when we say controlling, what we mean is when we create subnational or lower levels of geography, we want things to sum up properly, but in the process of making these estimates, they may not necessarily perfectly align. So what we typically do is we start with our national, this is our normal process, we create national estimates because we have the most confidence in that level. There's just a lot of detail. There's not a lot of small cells, not a lot of things to worry about like that. So we'll create those national estimates, and that will be the target for the subnational estimates. So if something changes, like the DA control, for example, brings up a particular age group, like 0 to 4-year-olds, that will, through this controlling process where we're trying to make states consistent with the nation, it will trickle down into the states and the counties, and it's proportionate. So if we saw a jump in the 1-year-olds in the national level, the states would have to sum up to that increase in the 1-year-olds to be consistent, so things sum up properly. Probably didn't do the best explaining that, but that's what these bars, these lines are meaning. It's kind of a circular thing. Once we get to the blended county estimates, that we can then aggregate everything up to the different levels of geographies. Things are consistent. We can make the data extracts we need for the rest of processing. Next slide. So what were the results? So as expected, the resident population totals matched the 2020 redistricting data exactly. The national resident population by single year of age and sex, the distributions matched 2020 DA pretty much exactly. So the totals for the nation would match the census, but how the age groups are distributed underneath that total would match the demographic analysis data. And race, Hispanic origin, and lower level geographic distributions matched vintage 2020 for the most part. That's because that's all we really had for those geographies. Because we use demographic analysis at the national level, the undercount for young children in 2010 census, which would be 10 to 14-year-olds in 2020, and the 2020 census, which would be 0 to 4-year-olds in 2020, was somewhat mitigated by the blended base. And I'll show you how this looks. We talk about this a little bit in a blog we wrote in April when we released the national estimates by age and sex. Next slide, please, Eric. So this is what we call a population pyramid. And this one's a little bit complicated because it has several different data sources on it. And the reason I'll walk through what these are. So the yellow line is the 2020 demographic analysis. The blue line is the vintage 2021 blended base. The green line is vintage 2020, so our older data, and the red line is the 2020 census. So at the national level, you can see the age sex distribution. You can see that vintage 2021 blended base and the 2020 DA, they pretty much lay right on top of each other. That's because the distributions are the same. However, you can see there are some deviations between the blended base in vintage 2020 and the blended base in the 2020 census. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to talk about the difference for the 0 to 5-year-olds. So here you can see that the 2020 census, the red line, for both males and females is lower than the blended base, the blue line. And this is the undercount of young children that DA mitigates. So it's bringing up the 0 to 4-year-olds and 0 to 5-year-olds just because we're using that DA distribution. Next slide. And then again, for the 10 to 14-year-olds, you can see that the green line, vintage 2020, is lower than the blended base. And this is because the vintage 2020 estimates are based on the 2010 census. So 10 years ago in 2010, these were the 0 to 4-year-olds that were undercounted. And because DA was used, it's again mitigating the impacts of the undercount from the 2020 or 2010 census. So moving on, next slide. We have two distinctly different things going on. We have the blended base research, which we did because we really didn't have an alternative. We didn't have time, but the timing of the census being delayed really made us look into novel approaches to creating a base population. But because we did the blended base, it opens up a few possibilities, and I think that this is a response to that. So the base evaluation research team, BERT, was formed to really look into the feasibility of using results from things like demographic analysis or the poster enumeration survey to improve the population estimates. So as opposed to the blended base, which was done because we had schedule constraints, BERT is more specifically focused on trying to improve the population estimates with these alternative data sources. So the team's relatively new, and it consists of subject matter experts in the area of population estimates, coverage, race and ethnicity, age and sex statistics, disclosure avoidance, and overall just demography. Next slide. So BERT has been meeting regularly since March, and we're currently developing a research plan and schedule. The estimates base, blended base, as I've been saying, for vintage 22, will still include data from the 2020 DA on age and sex. Further improvements, such as specifically focused on different race and ethnic groups, are really contingent on the results of this research and would not be incorporated until later vintages. So we don't expect BERT's research to impact vintage 2022. Any changes that are made to estimates methodology, as always, requires extensive research, testing, and review. We have a very thorough review process, and we try to do things in a very methodical, deliberate way. And we're very careful about doing things without really understanding what the impacts are. And BERT is really interested in keeping stakeholders updated on our research plans and project progress. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this as time goes on. But that's it for now. I'll pass it off to Eric.
Great, thanks, Luke. I'm going to talk about the Young Children Working Group. So the Census Bureau formed a cross-directorate team focusing on the undercount of young children and also improving data for this population. And that's something we're really stressing, is that we're not just focused on the undercount, because if we were, then our focus would be improving that for 2030, and that's a long way off. We want to do whatever we can to improve data for young children before, of course, we're thinking about 2030 and also thinking about how we can improve data on children's surveys, coverage or representation of children's surveys, but really we're focused on things we can do now and also in the lead up to 2030. So again, this is a cross-directorate team. It's made up of different staff from the Population Division, the Decennial Statistical Studies Division, the American Community Survey Office, the Demographic Directorate, and also the Office of Strategic Alliance. And it's really exciting because we're bringing together people with subject matter expertise in coverage measurement, statistics, administrative records, age and sex statistics, census and survey operations, demography, and also partnerships. So a lot of the people that are on the working group, some of the people have been involved for quite a few years. Myself, I've been working on the coverage of young children for almost 10 years here at the Census Bureau. Scott Kanicki from DSSD, he led several efforts in the last decade. Karen Deaver. So these are people that a lot of you who have been working on this issue as well will know and be familiar with their work. And then we have people that are kind of new to the issue, but we're excited because some of the people like have specific, they work specifically on, say, the American Community Survey. And so we can kind of understand it from a little bit different perspective than what we did last decade. So the team has been meeting regularly since February. In March, we released an American Count story about the undercount of young children in 2020 census. And we also have developed a charter document that outlines the scope and focus of the working group. This is commonly something that we do at the Census Bureau with working groups or task force. Task force is we develop a charter document that lays out what it is the group is going to be focusing on, just sort of defines the group. As I mentioned, we released an American Count story in March. We wanted to have this out the same day that the information about the undercount of young children was made public. We thought that was important, especially given how many stakeholders had been, working with us, partnering with us on this issue for quite a few years in the lead up to 2020 and during the 2020 census, that we wanted to inform them about what the Bureau is specifically doing on this issue. This figure comes from that American Count story. It shows demographic analysis estimates of net coverage error by select age groups from 1970 to 2020. The young children age 0 to 4, that's the blue line at the bottom. Then we have 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and 15 to 19 as the purple line at the top. What we see here, and everyone who's familiar with this issue knows well, is that the undercount of young children, it's a persistent issue. That in every census from 1970 to 2020, looking at these different ages, young children have the largest undercount. And where some age groups, the coverage seems to have gotten better over time, we don't see that for young children, that it's actually getting worse over time. And so this is, one of the reasons why we have this cross-directorate group, is to focus on things we can do moving forward, looking towards 2030 for the next census. This figure also comes from the American Count story. This is the demographic analysis estimates of net coverage error for children by single year of age in 2010 and 2020. So 2020 is the red line, 2010 is the blue line. And as we see in 2020, the largest undercounts were for the youngest ages, so age 0. And then we see it gradually improve, get closer to zero, which would be full coverage. In 2010, we see that the coverage at age 0 was actually higher than what we see at ages 1 and 2, and some of the other ages. That's because, in part, in 2010, there were a lot of babies that were born after Census Day who were included in the census. And I know Debbie grabbed 2010 numbers so we can have a more the big take home here is that the biggest undercounts are usually for the youngest ages. So the working group was formed in February. I'm a co-chair of the working group. Lauren Medina, who's in Population Division, she's chief of the Foreign-Born Population Branch. She's the other co-chair. I think she's on the call today. She might have, I hope she's able to make it, but.
Yep, I'm here. Hey, everyone.
Great. Hey, Lauren. So the working group has 4 areas that we're focusing on. So first is research, and this is research on why young children are missed in the census and surveys. Next is improving data collection on young children. So for this, we're looking forward to 2030, but we're also thinking about how we can improve data collection in the demographic surveys before 2030, so we don't have to wait clear until then. Next, we have improving data on young children, and Luke just talked a lot about the blended base. This is something that we really see can have a big impact on data for young children. He mentioned this in his slides, but just to kind of repeat, the population estimates have a lot of different uses. They're used to control, they're used as population controls for all of the demographic surveys. They're used for funding allocations. They're used by academic researchers and others. So improving the count for young children, improving that estimate of young children, and mitigating the undercount we see in the census goes a long way for overall improving data on young children. And I think that population pyramid that you showed, where we see relative to the 2020 census number, the estimates are higher for young children, and even mitigating what we see in the 2010 census, you know, for those cohorts that are now age 10 to 14. I think that is such a powerful illustration of what the blended base is doing for those ages. And then finally, a focus of our working group is outreach with stakeholders. We are lucky that we have such good partners that have worked closely with the Census Bureau for quite a while, that do so much, you know, for this issue, bringing awareness, also doing their own research, and working with their partner organizations to just to help with this issue. So these are the 4 areas that the working group is focusing on. Again, it's research on why young children are missed, trying to improve data collection, improve data on young children, and then also working with our partners as we move forward. So that's it for our presentation. Now we'd just like to open it up and have questions. I'm gonna quit sharing the screen so I can actually see what's going on. But if there are specific slides you want to return to, I can pull that back up. So Deb, I don't know how you wanted to, are you moderating the questions or?
Yeah, I'm happy to moderate them. And I'm gonna kick us off with a question about the research you're planning, which is, what are you planning to look at the impact of the blended base on Black and Hispanic communities, and when would that research be available, so that people, you know what is coming in the future?
So as we make blended base simulations, this is Luke, by the way, we review them in a variety of ways. We look at the blended base by all those demographic characteristics to make sure that there are no unintended consequences to the changes that we are making. And that is a big reason why it takes a long time for us to implement these changes, because as you might imagine, there's a lot of detail that the estimates publish. So we want to make sure that we don't impact a particular race group or an ethnic group or age group in a way that we didn't intend. We want to make sure that we are fully aware of how our data sources are being used and how it's impacting the population. And this might actually get a little bit to the question in chat, if I may try to just loop that in here. When we made the national adjustment for including DA, so when we included DA as one of the for age sex at the national level, we did look at how this is really impacting states and counties. And as you might imagine, it's complicated, but the simple answer is we made no explicit attempt to try to make any adjustments for the undercount or overcounts of people at the state or county level. But the controlling process that I kind of described, because the national level age distribution shifted because of that DA control, it did kind of trickle down into the states and then from the states into the counties. It was proportionate to the size of the population in that particular age sex category for that particular state or county. But you do see some changes there, but it's nothing that we did where we focused on something specific for a state. We really just relied on our controlling process to distribute the undercounts or overcounts down to the states and counties.
Okay, so I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm actually going to invite some of my co-hosts to pose their questions first and then come back to mine. And let's start with Naleo and with Arturo or Dorian. Do you guys want to pose some of your questions, and then we can
I
go
will
back to
defer
Bill's
to
other
Dorian.
and Jerry? Okay.
Great. Thank you, Arturo. Let me see. So we had a couple of questions. I think one of them it certainly relates to the methodology in future estimates. You know, I know you've spoken a little bit about how you're going to be approaching the blended base, you know, certainly for the 2022. Can you lend a little bit more insight around your approach for future blended base, certainly, and how that might apply to the population estimates? Are you thinking about it from the perspective of incremental improvements on the current methodology, or potentially going back to a previous methodology, or otherwise? So maybe you can shed a little bit of light or expand on some of the things that you've already shared.
Sure. So certainly vintage 2022 is an incremental approach. We're trying to take some things we saw from vintage 2021 that we just didn't really have time to add, and enhance the blended base to include those things. Our goal has always been to try to include as much census data as we can. And so I think for future vintages like vintage 2023, we'll be looking at trying to incorporate some of the race and Hispanic origin data from the census, assuming that so one of the things we're waiting for is just that our research on the modified race gets completed. So we actually have a starting point. We have the modified race from the census in our race categories for the estimates, and we can start using that data. But I think it also relates to the BERT research. We're eagerly watching how the BERT research goes, and if there are any good suggestions or things that we could possibly do to improve the estimates. We're always interested in that. We're always interested in trying to find ways to make our estimates better. The blended base did give us an opportunity to bring in DA, which would be really nice. And I think for future vintages, we'll be looking to see if there's other things we can do, and what the feasibility of implementing those changes would be. But yeah, so vintage 2023, my guess is we'll be looking at trying to bring in some of the race detail from the census, and the ethnicity detail from the census. And beyond that, I don't really know. I think that really is dependent on BERT and the findings there.
Okay. And if I just do a quick follow-up on something you mentioned, would it be a fair assumption then that if the research comes back, especially as it relates to the 2020 data, certainly around race and particularly around Hispanic and Latino demographic information, that it's not sufficient or adequate, especially considering some of the things that we're already seeing with regards to the undercount, that it would not be used? Is that something that you're also sort of playing with and having to contend, and why the research and evaluation is really important?
Yeah, so I think the BERT research is really important in that sense. It really is, the blended base, as I said earlier, it was something to create an estimates base when we didn't have census data, whereas BERT is really looking at improving accuracy. So I think the different subject matter experts that are contributing to BERT will be looking at those different things and coming back to the estimates and saying, look, maybe you should look at adding these data to your estimates processing to try to bump up a particular population, or maybe you should think about how you're implementing or how you're using certain census data. I think we'll watch that eagerly. But yeah, so right now it's really the incremental approach for us to try to get vintage 2022 out the door. But for future vintages, I think that research from BERT will be really helpful in determining what we should and shouldn't use from the census, and if we need to bring in other data sources.
Great, thank you. Extremely helpful.
And just to add to that, the blended base approach is actually quite complicated to implement. It was difficult to get it to work in a way that produced demographically reasonable results. And I think our team did a wonderful job getting Vintage 2021 done. It looks beyond our expectations, I think. But every little change requires a lot of testing and review and development. So patience is appreciated with us as we try to do our best. But it's a slow process, and we want to make sure that when we do it right.
Great. Dorian, did you have another question?
I want to leave some room for others, but certainly I can ask the other question that I had that I think hasn't been covered, or at least I didn't see it in the presentation.
Okay, and then we'll go to Jerry after that, so she can be ready to go next.
Sounds good. So I think the other question that we had certainly is around looking at the 2022 vintage specifically. Can you share with us a little bit more around the blended base to address the undercount of young children and children in the 2020 census, specifically any improvements with respect to the undercount of Latino children for ages other than 0 to 4? I know that for the vintage 2021, I heard the Census Bureau sort of refer to it as somewhat mitigating the undercount of young children in the 2020 census for ages 0 to 4, but I haven't heard about the other ages as well. So I wanted to see, what are some of the improvements for that 2022 vintage that you've made specifically for those age groups and beyond?
So I don't think, unless things change in the next few months, I don't expect to expand our use of DA beyond what we've already done in a way that would affect the young children too much. I think we're looking at trying to expand our use of DA for older ages. But we can't really we've looked into using DA for a variety of other characteristics. And like I said, sometimes for example, we looked at some variables where we would, I think the voting age is a good example. We looked at trying to use the voting age from the PL data as extra information to help the blended base. But that constraint limited how the DA estimates were distributed across the ages, because you're basically forcing them to be either 0 to 17 within that group or 18 and older. So that created an unforeseen consequence that we decided didn't result in something we wanted or comfortable with. So we took that out and we ended up using just totals from the census. For vintage 2022, I think our use of DA will pretty much be the same. We're going to be using vintage 2020 again for a lot of those demographic characteristics. And I don't know of any other research items for vintage 2022 specifically that will focus on undercounts of any race or Hispanic group by age. So, we'll keep using DA for now until we have more information, hopefully from Bert, to kind of inform us on what our alternatives are.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, like Luke was saying, the numbers that we're using from demographic analysis are only age and sex, and they're only at the national level. But one thing we have thought about is that given that like Black children and Hispanic children make up a large portion of that 0 to 4 population, what we're doing with the blended base is going to indirectly mitigate the undercounts, for those populations as well as it impacts young children. So we do think there is some benefit that we can't really measure, but that is indirect for those populations.
Dorian, I don't know if you noticed, but Jerry encouraged you to keep going in the chat because you were asking the questions she's interested in. We will go to Jerry afterwards, but if you've got more, go ahead.
I'll hand it over to Jerry to continue the questions you might have.
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't have a lot, and I'm gonna, pretty much present mine in a very simplistic, non-technical manner, but you all have been great. And it's really good to know that you all have done enough research to see that the impact for Black and Brown children in particular, as it pertains to applying the blended base, will be beneficial. So that's really, really encouraging. But I do have a question, so Black men in particular, they're undercounted from every age group, from 0 to 4, Black males. and then on up from cradle to grave. So the impact of applying the blended base on the accuracy of the data for overall race populations that are already undercounted was a concern. And I think you mentioned that you have to wait for the modified race file, the research from that, to determine if there are any impacts on the accuracy of data for race and ethnic groups. And I also have a question with respect to differential privacy. Does that complicate matters? Where does that take us in the scheme of things with respect to the accuracy of data overall for race and ethnic groups, and then particularly for, as you apply blended data to for young children, will there be an impact? And that's my only question right here. And I do have to say hello to my dear colleague and friend, Debbie Griffin. We've been in rooms many, many times together. So it's good to see you, Debbie. And I'll stop there, Eric.
Luke, did you address differential privacy?
Yeah. So the first part I would mention is the modified race. You brought that up, and the modified race so essentially with the census data, I don't want to just over explain this, but there's some other race category in the 2020 census is collected. And for our estimates processing, because a lot of administrative records don't have some other race, we have to figure out a way to try to make our base population as compatible with those administrative data sources like birth records, death records. And so we have to figure out how to distribute the some other race group. And Eric's actually leading this effort, how to distribute the some other race category across the other races that we do use in estimates processing. And that takes time. So we can't really look to be using the 2020 census data until we've made it compatible with our estimates processing. And that's what I meant by we can't really look at the some other rate, or we can't really use census until we get modified race. There are other parts of the population division and census that looked at the accuracy of the race detail in the census as part of getting the PL data out the door.
Yeah.
And they're not in our area, but I'm sure Eric probably is more familiar with those efforts than I am. But yeah, that's what I meant by that. But for differential privacy, that's a different topic altogether. So for our sub-county estimates, we learned a lot about using the unnoisy version of the 2020 census and adding noise, because our sub-county estimates that are released today or this week, they start with the non-noisy file, and then we add noise using a differential privacy mechanism that CEDDA, the Center for Enterprise Dissemination and Disclosure Avoidance, provided us. They worked really hard with us to get us something that worked really well. As we move forward with county and above, if we start trying to use the census data and we can't use something like the public noisy file, we would still have to abide by the Census Bureau privacy standards. So differential privacy certainly would be something that we'd have to work with other parts of the census and get approval for. If we wanted to use data from the unprotected file, and that's something we know will happen in the future. We're not there yet. I think we're still trying to get organized and think through what we do need and what we don't need. But differential privacy is something that we're going to be dealing with for the years to come, I'm sure. So, yeah.
So is it safe to say then, just so I can get it clear in my own head, that you don't know that the benefit of using blended based data is proving to be beneficial in terms of data accuracy for 0 to 4 age children? However, we don't really know how it will improve, or whether there's no difference at all as it relates to how the blended base, applying it to children, will impact race and ethnic counts or the accuracy of data for race and ethnic populations overall. Is that a safe thing to say? And we have to wait until BERT finishes its research? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, the current method, yeah, it doesn't make any deliberate adjustments to any specific race or ethnic group, aside from just using the vintage 2020 estimates, and are usually, which were based off the 2010 census. As time goes on, we'll be doing evaluations of the estimates we produced in 2020 and looking for places that we were different from the census or close to the census, and also looking at DA and seeing where the estimates were close to DA or not close to DA. And that effort is underway right now.
Okay.
And that's really where we'll know how and where the estimates were accurate or not. And every year we actually review our estimates thoroughly after we make our final version, and we look at a lot of that too. We look at where are we seeing demographically unreasonable changes in the population by age, sex, or race, Hispanic origin. And it's part of our usual review process.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Barry, do you have more questions? No? Okay. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask Deb Weinstein and Joe Battistelli from CHN if they've got some. But my first question for you is a language question. Are you not calling the vintage estimates for 2022 and beyond blended base? Was blended base really only 2021? I just want to make sure we all use common language.
So the blended base refers to the starting point for the vintages, and vintage 2022 will be using a blended base. So the starting point for vintage 2022 will be the blended base. And vintage 2023, I think we're kind of waiting to see how we get census data and all that. There's still too many variables there to really know, but any vintage that we use the blended base as our starting point would be a vintage where the blended base, it's a blended base vintage if you wanted to call it that. Yeah.
And for now, we know, 2021 was, 2022 will be, 2023 is still a decision and process.
Yep. Yeah, we're focusing right now on vintage 2022 and all the different parts of that, making that data. But it's definitely going to have a blended base as a starting point.
Okay, so then my second question is a little more substantive. We've been talking about undercounts, but we also know that overcounts also end up misallocating federal funding, because when you have a set amount of dollars with an appropriations funded program, if some communities get too much because they were overcounted, and I'm now thinking particularly about how rural communities, at least for young children, tend to get overcounted and big cities get undercounted. Curing or reducing the overcount will also help direct funding to the kids who need it most. Maybe not as much, because I don't know that it's as bad, but still it will also help in addition to fixing the undercount. Does your current approach to the blended base help address overcounts? And are you looking at how to make it more accurate from an overcount perspective too, going forward?
So nationally, we use DA for all the age groups, whether or not they were undercounted or overcounted. So where the DA estimates picked up an overcount, or they said there was an overcount, that would be included in the blended base. We would adjust for that according to the demographic analysis, age, sex distribution. Subnationally, we haven't really looked into overcounts and undercounts yet. I think that's still research that's ongoing, and that will probably be part of BERT, I imagine. We have coverage experts as part of that team. And now with the PS results coming out at the subnational level, we're getting a better sense of coverage in the census. So all that will help play into how we decide to move forward. But for now, it's just that national adjustment that does have adjustments for undercounts and overcounts.
Okay. I do have more, but I'm going to see first if Deb Weinstein and Joe Battistelli from CHN have some questions for you. And I also very much want to encourage the rest of the folks on this call to raise their hand or put questions in the chat so that everybody has a chance to understand a little better what's happening here. But let's start with Deb. Joe, do you guys have any particular questions you want to present?
Thanks, Debbie. Coalition on Human Needs, our concerns are spread across all of the sort of population groups that have been focused on here. And I should say thank you very much for doing this first. So my first question, it may be that I'm just not understanding everything as much as I should, but we're very concerned that in the upcoming years that funding is fairly distributed, among the communities that need it the most. And so in a way, following up from Jerry's question, it would apparently take a while longer to get fuller information about the effect of the blended base on, the older part of the population of Black and Hispanic in particular. And so I'm just wondering, sort of what your response to us is about how we try to ensure the fairest funding possible, before some of the complete information that you're looking. So that's one question. I have another one, but I'll give you a chance to answer that one first.
So when we made the blended base, one of the reasons why we included demographic analysis is because we really have a lot of confidence in the quality of the DA estimates. And I think that, just the results speak for themselves. They show that the demographic analysis estimates being included really improved our blended base. Aside from that, every year we look at our method and our input data sources in now our base and try to improve it to make the best estimates we can. So when you're making your decisions, all I can really say is you can trust that we're doing our best on our end to make the estimates accurate and fair for everybody. And it does take time to do some of the methodological changes, but every year we really take a step back and we try to make methodological changes or input data changes that would improve the quality of the estimates. Yeah, I guess that's all I could really say to that. Eric, I don't know if you have anything, or Christine.
One thing just to kind of emphasize, and I know Luke's said it several times, is that when we make changes or improvements or anything we do with the methodology for the population estimates, there's a lot of work that goes into that. We test everything, we review what we simulate, we review, we test, there's a lot. And so we're thinking very carefully about these issues. But again, it takes time. So that's why we have our research agenda for, this year, and the base evaluation research team, it's fairly young, you might say. And we're really, thinking carefully about how, what improvements can be made and looking for an eye, towards doing it in the most, equitable way that we can.
Thank you very much for that. And I don't doubt that. And part of it's, this is a part of helping us to understand how you're coming up with these estimates, which will help us. So thank you for that. I guess my second question is, everything that you've said seems to suggest that the blended base is helpful improvement in accuracy at minimum for children and seemingly very potentially for the other groups that we're talking about today. If it is helping, why wouldn't the expectation be that you would continue to use some variant of it in all those upcoming years, not stopping after 22?
It's a good question. I think it really just, with the accuracy research going on with BERT, I think we would really just say we're waiting to see how that turns out before we make any decisions with whether and how we want to use the blended base. For now, it really is the best we have. And a lot of that was just timing. Like I said before, we made the blended base because we didn't have census detail that we needed. And I don't think it was ever intended to be a permanent addition to the estimates processing. Not to say that we couldn't do that. But it served its purpose, and it did a really good job at that. And now we're looking at trying to expand it and try to maximize this opportunity as best we can. But it's just hard to be too committal about anything at this point because we're still planning a lot of different projects and research.
Thanks.
I'm going to go ahead and oh no, we have a question from Michelle. Could you talk a little bit about the timing impact on, the timing of the impacts on the distribution of federal resources? I mean, we know that you put out the vintage estimates or the population estimate series every summer. When do those then get used by the agencies, and when does it affect the annual funding allocation?
It depends on, so we make a number of deliverables a year. I mean, over 150, I think we deliver different data extracts to different stakeholders. One of our first deliverables is to the current population survey, which we give to them in January, and they use that for controls for the CPS, and they work closely with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But aside from that, we release our estimates kind of on a rolling basis. So we create them in the fall, and our first release of the year would be in December. And a lot of that data that we release in December is going to be the same data that's delivered over to whether it's the Senate, the Federal Election Commission, or CPS. And then as the year goes on, we deliver more and more detail. So in March, we release it's the first time we released, December, we released the national state level resident population, components of change, and the voting age population. And then when we get into March, we release the same data for counties without the voting age population there. So it's the county level detail, the components of change for the resident population. And then April, we released the national age sex distribution for the resident population. May, this week, we released the sub-county estimates for the resident population and the housing unit estimates for the nation states and counties. And then our last release of the year is in June, which is the full detail characteristic files for the nation states and counties. And that's where you would see the age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin detail, that a lot of what we've been talking about here. So it's a rolling basis, and how different stakeholders use that information, I can't really say. But what I can say is we usually don't deliver data early. So we usually don't provide, unless there's a special circumstance, like it's another federal agency that needs it early, we don't deliver our characteristics data before June to anybody that requested it. Even if it's a special tabulation, we usually give it to them after the public files are released. And Christine probably can speak more to that because she's more familiar with that process, but I think that covers it.
Oh, one comment. So,
I think you, oh, go ahead.
oh, go ahead. So in the chat, I put a
say that, no,
working paper. Go ahead, Christine.
that, I think the important point is that we provide the estimates, but we don't necessarily have insight into how the stakeholders are using them, including other federal agencies. So, from time to time, they may mention to us that the reason they're requesting the data is because they need it for a funding allocation, but otherwise, we don't really have anything to do with that element of it. But I mean, Luke gave some good examples. I know that we deliver data to the Department of Education, they have a July 1st deadline that they use for some kind of funding formula. But it's just kind of in passing that we learn that information. We generally just try to stay pretty separate from the funding part of it.
Yeah, I was going to say I put a link in the chat to a working paper from 2017 that sort of lists all of the federal programs that use they use census data, whether that's ACS or population estimates, and it talks a little bit about that. And really, you'd have to look at the specific programs and what their, dates that they use for timing and everything.
Michelle, do you have a follow-up to that, or does that answer your question?
I'm noodling that. I think for now that answers my question. Yeah, and I'll look at the report. So thank you for dropping that in the chat.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple, but everybody else, do please go ahead and pop questions in the chat and raise your hand. One question that we had was, are you going to be producing formal research papers? And if so, when would we expect to get those?
I don't know. We have released a number of blogs, and we did release a working paper last year, but the working paper was specifically focused on differences between the 2020 estimates and the census. And then the blogs, they varied from talking about the blended base and the methods and the input data that we use to some of the results. I don't know if any of that will turn into any kind of like peer-reviewed paper or research paper, but maybe Eric has something on the horizon. I don't think anything is on my horizon.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything on blended base.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying we don't have anything formal. I don't have anything formal planned on blended base.
Okay.
I would be surprised if, the BERT research resulted in some kind of adjustment and we did not have a paper. So I think that, there will probably be documentation supporting the outcome of the BERT research, regardless of what direction it goes in.
Okay. I have one question, and then I'm going to go to Deb Griffin, and then I know Joe Battistelli has a question after that. So my question for you is that earlier this week, I think it was, maybe it was last week, time blurs, the Bureau released new PES data, and in the release of that, there was some talk about using the results of the post-enumeration survey to improve the post-2020 population estimates. Can you talk about how you might use the post-enumeration survey to do that? And I will add the caveat that we do know that for very young children, the post-enumeration survey is not very accurate. So if you are using it, how are you doing it in a way that prevents bringing in the inaccuracies on young children, but also how are you planning to use it generally?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what BERT is supposed to be doing. They, as you had mentioned, you could bring in potentially a data source to improve something, and it could have a negative, unforeseen consequence on something else. And so BERT is really looking into those like the PS and whether or not it's something we want to use to adjust the estimates and to improve the accuracy. And then this next step would just be to see if we can actually do it logistically, if the process that we use to create the estimates can support a change like that. So there's many steps to that that we still haven't gotten to because the research just started. But that's exactly the kinds of things that the BERT team will be looking at. I guess BERT team makes no sense. BERT will be looking at because it's in there.
When you refer to BERT, I keep thinking it's a person that we should invite on to the
No.
Deb Griffin, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I had 3 questions, and then Deb, you asked one of them, so I'm down to 2. But I guess for Luke, I really wanted to make sure I understood. I thought I heard you say that any impact on the vintage 2022 estimates on race and Hispanic origin would be indirect, that it's unlikely that you would be using either DA or PES coverage estimates by race or Hispanic origin. And did you say that, or did I mishear that?
No, that's correct. It would be indirect in the sense that we're using DA by age sex. Mm-hmm. And so when we do something that adjusts the 0 to 4-year-olds, that will trickle into the different race and ethnic groups by age and sex. But we're not making any specific change to target any particular race or ethnic group. We're really just focusing on using DA by total resident population, age, and sex.
And that's true then for what BERT is looking at right now will still have that limitation because that's already a conclusion you've drawn, or are they still pursuing the potential of using PES or GA coverage estimates by race?
Yeah, so they're very different. So the blended base is developed by production staff in my
Okay.
branch and some other branches, and it's very much like how do we make estimates, and so that's where the focus is. BERT is more focused on the research aspect of looking at can we use PS to improve the estimates, and I think race and ethnicity is certainly on the table.
Okay.
And there are a lot of open research questions there that they'll be looking at. So it's nothing's discounted yet. We're just the blended base is more like functionally trying to produce something that we can create our estimates with.
Got it. Thank you.
I think I
That's
would like
great.
to chime in here, just to offer, more of a distinction. And I know Luke has covered this, but, when we developed the blended base, we were essentially taking our vintage 2020 estimates that we already had, based on the 2010 census, and we were improving upon those estimates in, a very limited window of time. And we did this without any insight into the census results. We didn't know what the age and sex results looked like from the 2020 census. And that was something that we kind of ended up seeing after the fact. And at that point, we were able to see that, the DA data did offer some improvement to the distribution, for the youngest children relative to what we were seeing in the 2020 census, which is why we use that phrase somewhat mitigate, because it wasn't that we were going in and adjusting census data. It was another data source that we brought in and seeing, this improvement as a result. So you can think of the blended base as our attempt to make the best estimates base possible with the resources that we had available to us. And now there's this BERT research effort, which is looking specifically at, what adjustments to 2020 census data may or may not be feasible, such as to the race and Hispanic origin data. And then it's our challenge to work those data into the estimate space. But I think everyone can see that it's a very complicated process and one that we need to go through, systematically and thoughtfully. And because there are just a lot of complexities to it, and trying to navigate the process of working with, as I know someone brought up, overcounts and undercounts. And, this is the reason that depending on what the outcome of the BERT research is, we'll need to put our results and our proposal into a federal register notice with a comments period so that everybody has the opportunity to weigh in on what we're proposing, because we know that there's going to be this notion of, improvement for some groups, but not for others. So it's something that we have to be so careful as we're working through this. But I know that it does get a little bit like murky when you're talking about blended base and BERT. There is this kind of overlap, but really the blended base was about making an estimate space with the data sources that we had, and BERT is about, how we might adjust things to improve upon the census data.
Thank you, Christine. That's real helpful. I guess my other question is generally about the current survey's use of for their controls, and is there a timetable of when ACS, for example, would be using, I'll just call it these alternative controls, whether it's blended base or something that BERT produces? Is there any talk about what release would be first impacted by that?
I'm not sure, but we're following our typical release schedule, and the estimates that we're creating using the blended base, they're considered the official estimates from the Census Bureau. So ACS would be presumably using them as controls in the same timetable that they normally do, but I can't speak to that specifically because we're not ACS people. But we are creating our estimates on our usual schedule, and BERT won't be creating the estimates; they'll inform estimates research. But as we move forward each vintage, it's going to be the same. The estimates that we publish are going to be the official estimates, and I assume ACS would use them the normal way that they use them.
And so, Eric,
right, we've already provided files to the ACS that included the blended base. So, they're factoring those into the estimates, on their own production schedule as usual.
Okay, great, thank you. And I guess my last question for Eric, and it has to do with, the first item you had on your list of what the working group is going to be doing. So to try to answer that why question, is there any research that the team is currently pursuing to try to answer the why are children missed in surveys and censuses? Or is that something still to be identified that'll happen in the future?
Well, we're still in the planning phase of research. We're also our team isn't the only we're not the only ones doing research on the undercounted young children at the Census Bureau, and that's a great thing, is that there's a lot of people that have interest. And so part of what our team does is to sort of get information about other projects going on and help relay that on to stakeholders. One of the things that the director is really passionate about is qualitative research, more participatory research. And when we met with him and talked about this issue, we've said, yeah, we learned a lot last decade, mining and kind of sifting through what data were available. But some of the research, some of the outstanding questions that we have and the others have on the undercounted young children, we need to have different approaches. So that's one thing that we're really stressing, is trying to propose some kind of like qualitative approaches or ways that we can ask some of those why questions. Because I know you were involved in a lot of that research, Debbie, and we went through everything we could that was out there, but there's still these long-standing questions about, we know that household structure is a big factor, but what is it about household structure, and so getting into some of those. So that's definitely on our agenda, to try to move in that direction, because again, it's where I think we need to be headed, to really understand this. And some of the work that the stakeholders did, on some of the surveys that you guys did and asking some of these questions. I mean, that's really invaluable and helpful for us, to understand, like, what is it we need to be asking about? Is it privacy concerns? What is it? What are the mechanisms? And that's what we haven't gotten to yet, and we hope to.
That's really good news. And I will say again, Eric, that, I worked pretty closely with our researchers. And in retrospect, there are questions I wished we had asked differently. And I'd be delighted to just kind of go through our research and talk about things that we didn't feel we got at as well as we would have liked to, that might help you think through your research.
That would be helpful, and we should set up a time to do that.
I'd be delighted to do that. I mean, it was a first crack. It was very early on. We learned an enormous amount since then. I have questions about the wording of household. I have thoughts about, how would you make that? Just a lot that I'd be happy to share to help you think about building in. But I do think it was a real eye-opener about how many people would respond, but didn't know if they should include their kid or wouldn't include their kids. So I'm glad to hear that you felt the same way. I'm going to turn it over to Joe Battistelli, who had a question.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also with the Coalition on Human Needs, and thank you guys for coming to this meeting. It's very helpful and informative. I wanted to talk about the other administrative sets that BERT may, if necessary, consider, and what process would be in place to evaluate those data sets for their usefulness and fit for use. And then as a follow-up, what sort of outside stakeholder engagement would be in place to allow outside expertise to help make that decision-making tree happen in that process?
So I can try to speak to this as best I can. The BERT research is going to be structured in a way where subject matter experts will be doing the research on their specialty, and also on alternative sources that they might know of or find while they're doing the research. So that would be part of the research process. And one of the key outcomes of the research phase of the BERT team or the BERT process is going to be trying to find alternative data sources that we might be interested in investigating, aside from just the DA and PS results. So each subject matter expert group is going to be looking at that and hopefully identifying useful data sets that we might that would look promising in improving the estimates. The external stakeholder engagement, I think Christine had mentioned an FRN would be going out. So that would certainly be a great way to get engagement. But also, I imagine we'll be doing more presentations to groups such as yourself about BERT and the progress. I know that we're always really happy to talk to people about what we're working on. So I hope that we'll be presenting to not just you, but we work closely with the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, which are state demographers from across the country. And they provide a lot of feedback on our estimates, on DA, on BERT, I imagine. So we'll hopefully provide plenty of opportunities to get feedback from experts outside of census and people, that other stakeholders.
And then just to clarify, those subject matter experts that you initially referenced, those are both internal and external to the Census Bureau, or just internal?
Currently internal.
Okay.
They're different internal subject matter experts. Yep.
Thank you.
So do we have anyone else who wants to ask questions? If not, I do have at least one more, but I really don't want to monopolize this. And Bill O'Hare, you put a couple of questions in the chat. Do you have follow-up to those, or do you have a question you want to ask?
No, I think I got answers to those, and I responded to the one about money a little bit more. But while we got people on the line, I just want to make, this is not a question, but the Bureau can't say this as directly as I can probably, but the estimates branch has been increasingly underfunded, if that's the right way to say it, over the last 10 or 15 years. And there is some effort by people outside the Bureau, particularly the Census Project, to try and make sure Congress provides more money for the estimates branch of the Census Bureau, because this work that we're doing, which we're talking about today, and other work in the estimates branch, is so fundamental to getting a fair distribution of federal resources. So I pass that along for others on this call, not the Census Bureau people, but the other ones, that if you have a chance to raise this issue with your congressperson or otherwise, I think it's an important issue that should be lifted up. So that's all I really wanted to add. I know the Bureau can't say that, but I don't think they'll deny it.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We are getting close to the end of our time together, though. So please, folks, if you've got additional questions, do put them in the chat or let me know. One of my questions for you is, what is the implications, if any, of the Bureau's decision to delay publication of the DHC files until May 2023 for the blended base program?
So delays in when we receive census data internally would just impact when and what we can use. I'm not sure the DHC schedule is going to have a huge impact on our plan. I think a lot of our work is still, modified race and the Hispanic origin. So I'm not sure that really is going to be related to the DHC too much. And aside from that, I mean, I think we've got enough on our plate for the next year or so. So I'm not too sure how much that's going to be impacting our plans that we have right now.
Okay.
I would say that the delay, what that changes for us is, the later the data become available to us, the longer it takes for us to be able to kind of examine it and see if it, meets our needs for estimates production. So, if we don't get the DHC data until next year, then that just means that, it limits the likelihood that we'll be able to pull it in, and it might put us down another path in terms of, what census data we use and how we incorporate it.
Thanks. Before I ask my final question, Dorian, I know you wanted to make sure everyone had a chance. Do you have anything else you want to ask at this point?
No, I think the Census Bureau, thank you again for taking the time to not only present to us and so forth, but also provide the information. I think they covered a lot of the questions that we had pertaining to the estimates. Certainly, we were also interested in hearing a little bit more about the update on BERT. So thank you for that information as well. I did see a question from Bill O'Hare earlier that I thought it was really interesting with regards to any evaluation or analysis or on the number of the estimate rather on lower geographies, and whether you've done any research on the improvement on that overall estimate, if you will. Let's say, especially when you compare it to, let's say, the 2020 census or anything like that, or have you not done any research beyond what you already have done with regards to the national number, certainly, or the national estimate?
So we really, when we developed the blended base and even to now, I mean, we don't have a lot of census data to use to compare to. So when we created the blended base, we had the PL data that was publicly available, and the age-sex distribution from DA, as Christina mentioned, that was the best we could kind of find at the time. And it's only been recently that we've been able to compare those data with the census by single year of age and sex. So I think that when we do our evaluations in production anyway, a lot of our efforts are focused on, do the data look demographically reasonable when we are making a deliberate change, like when we implemented the DA controls or the DA, the DA control nationally. But then subnationally, if we're not making any deliberate change or focus change on a particular state or county, we're really making sure that the controlling process is working as it was expected to work, so that our processing isn't causing any unexpected shifts. Everything's going according to what we intended. They're not, at the time when we created Vintage 2021, there weren't a lot of comparisons to census. A lot of the comparisons were making sure that we weren't creating any implausible population distributions. As we move forward for Vintage 2022, and as we get more and more census data, we'll be obviously including that, just to make sure that we again are doing everything according to how we intended, and that everything is looking demographically reasonable. But it just it's taking time. It takes time to get that data and to work it into our evaluations. So I know that's kind of a rambling answer, but yes, I guess we'll be looking at the census as we move forward, and we thoroughly review our products with the data that we have available at the time of producing the data.
Bill, do you mean to have your?
Yeah, I want to follow up on this a little bit. I understand why you don't have the 2020 census data for states and counties for 0 to 4 to compare the blended base estimates to, but could you not do the same thing with the 2010 data? Compare a blended base and compare it to the census? Have you done that? And if so, can we see the results?
Well, I don't know if you could see the results, but I can describe to you how we developed the blended base. So when we made the blended base, we essentially made the 2010 blended base, and we compared it to Vintage 2010, and we created the blended base using the same data that in 2010 that we would have for 2020. So we used the 2010 DA and the same level of detail that we were planning on using it for 2020. We used the 2010 census totals, or different levels of detail depending on which simulation or test we were doing, and we used the 2010 April estimates. So that was really the bulk of our research was focused on the 2010 blended base, because we had those census counts to compare to. So that was kind of our benchmark, I guess you could say, to all the different simulations that we ran and tested. And then once we had a method that we were comfortable with, that looked promising, that looked demographically reasonable, and was thoroughly reviewed by not just the people who produced the data, but our review team, they're separate independent reviewers, then we moved to 2020. Because then we didn't have that full detail 2020 data to benchmark against. So we wanted, go ahead.
It seemed like that results would be very helpful for stakeholders to understand the implications that for state and county, actually for young children, but also for the Black population, for Hispanics. The results in 2010 are probably a pretty good barometer of what's likely to happen in 2020. So I don't know if you're able to share that or not, but it would be helpful, I think, for stakeholders.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely keep that in mind. It was definitely useful in review, because we did review everything by a lot of different characteristics, and having the 2010 census there as a comparison really helped us understand how the blended base was working, and whether or not the controls that we were implementing were doing what we thought they should be doing.
Thank you.
So I have two follow-ups. One is, I just want to be clear about, I understand why you have to wait to get the modified race file to look at the impact of the blended base and on Black communities. Is there a reason why you can't look sooner at the impact on Hispanic communities, that's not dependent on the modified race file.
No, it's not. When we did our simulations for vintage 2021, we had to make some decisions about the level of detail we'd be using for the blended base. And I think, after doing a number of simulations, and because we want to do this in a very careful, methodical way, we stuck with the simplest approach for our first go that we published because we were the most confident in that version. And that was the version that had totals from the census. As we move forward to vintage 2021, you're right, the Hispanic origin data is out there. It's part of the PL data. However, we identified a few areas that we thought were more things that we were able to do with the resources we have to fix the, update the blended base and make it more accurate for different universes like the group quarters population, household population, or the older population. And then for vintage 2023, I hope the blended base does start using race and Hispanic origin. But it's a big project. So the items we're working on now really did eat up all of our resources in trying to get the blended base to be improved over what was released in vintage 2021.
Okay, so that added, so first of all, let me say, I really don't want to get ahead of Naleo here, and I invite Arturo and Dorian to speak after I say this. But from my perspective, Hispanic young kids are the kids who were missed the most in 2010. We know there was a big drop in the count of Hispanic populations overall, which I assume will affect Hispanic young children. And for us, it's a very high priority to look at how you can correct for that in the blended base. And
I agree. I'm not trying to say it isn't a priority for us either. I think, for us, we look at what resources we have, the time we have, the data we have available, and things that we identified in the previous run that we used for vintage 2021 that we just marked as things we need to fix or expand on. And that's really what we have to focus on this time. But we definitely have those as high priority projects, and we want to do it, like I said, in a way that's fair and that we don't mess anything up by trying to move too quickly. So it's definitely a priority for us too. I agree with you.
So my last two questions are political, and if you are not authorized to answer them, just say so. But my first question is, if it's an issue of resources, is that something that those of us who can talk to Congress should be identifying as one of the needs and one of the purposes of getting more funding to you? I don't know if you can answer that.
I think what I can say is that, if we had a larger staff, we would be able to accommodate more research more efficiently. I mean, that's pretty much all that I can really say about it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Second question is, I think everyone on this call is very excited about the potential of the blended base to correct some of these serious and long-term undercounts to different populations. And we really appreciate the fact that you are doing this work. What I'm wondering is if you're getting any pushback from people who say, no, you should just stick with the 2020 census. This is not real, it's political payback. Or are you getting any pushback for what you're doing on this? Is this something that we may, as stakeholders, need to be prepared to defend?
Internally, I feel like we have a lot of support for looking into this. I mean, I know that we've even heard the director talk about how important it is for us to pursue this and to, do whatever we can essentially to determine if it's feasible to make adjustments so that communities have the proper representation and proper funding levels. I mean, it's a major priority for the director, and I feel like, at least from my own experiences, the other areas of census that we've interacted with, they have all followed suit. So internally, at least, amongst our colleagues, we haven't been receiving pushback. Just kind of a matter at this point of logistics, how do we make this research happen?
Okay, and have you gotten any external reaction that was negative?
I mean, I have not fielded anything like that. I don't know, Luke or Eric, have you had any experiences like that?
Most of the experiences I have had are just questions about what we did and how we did it. I can't say I've had a bad experience so far, but just a lot of questions. And naturally, people are curious about what we did and how we did it.
And what we're planning
Yeah,
to
that's
do
most
in
of
our
the feedback.
timeline. And that's information, yeah, that we're definitely, eager to be able to provide to our stakeholders to give a better sense of, how we see this research that we're doing now playing out.
Well, we're certainly, I mean, we obviously have lots of questions. We want to understand it. We care very much about what it ends up meaning, but regardless of what we think it does end up doing, I think we're all excited by its potential. And I want to thank you very much for joining us today and answering our questions and being willing to share this. And the partnership and Coalition on Human Needs would be delighted at any time to host future conversations to help, build the understanding of what you're doing. Arturo and Debbie and Jerry, do you guys want to add anything to what I said as co-sponsors of this call?
Just want to echo what you said, and I do appreciate the plain English speak too. It was very helpful. These are complicated issues for many of our groups, and so I just really appreciate the effort, and thank you, Deb, for pulling this together as well.
I was delighted to do it. It seemed really important. Dorian, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you again, Deborah, for also putting it together and so forth. Thank you for the Bureau for certainly providing us with some value information. I think what Deborah said is really key, right? Is this idea of us really caring about the information and certainly what we can do with this information and knowing the connection it has to the community and so forth, and understanding the community that, again, we really value the time that we get with the Census Bureau, certainly in getting a little bit more of an insight as to how you're sort of approaching the work, certainly, and how you're certainly improving that approach as well. So again, extremely appreciative of that. Thank you.
Deb?
Without Deb Weinstein on the call, I'll just take a moment to say CHN incredibly values both our partners here at NALEO, National Urban League, and of course the partnership, and especially with those of you at the Census Bureau that are willing to engage with us and always come talk to us. It increases our understanding. It allows us to get insight and understanding of where we're going, and we hope to continue this on through this entire process.
So with that, I invite any of our census friends to say a few closing words.
I would just like to say thank you for having us. We always really enjoy reaching out to people and talking with people and hearing the kinds of questions and concerns you have. They certainly allow us to appreciate, just how much people care about the data we produce. And it in a lot of ways, I think, makes us feel more motivated to make the estimates even better. So thank you so much for all your great questions and just having us.
We're definitely happy to have this opportunity, and it's always very informative and insightful for us to hear what questions you have. And I think that, we would be more than happy to be back with this group again when we have more to share.
Yeah, and just to echo what Christine and Luke said, we appreciate the feedback, especially. It's good to know what issues you guys feel are most important, and as we're prioritizing research on blended-based research on BERT, also work with young children, it's really helpful to have that feedback. So thank you.
Well, we're just incredibly grateful that you are receptive to it. And with that, I want to thank you so much, and make sure you see the thank you in the chat, and say goodbye, and we will turn off the recording. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'd be delighted to have you back at any time.
Thank you.
Thank you.